The saddest lie a person can believe is that they were never meant to be loved. Every morning, Nathan Brooks followed the same quiet routine. Before the sun reached the tops of the snow-covered pine trees, he unlocked the wooden gates of the small wildlife rehabilitation center hidden deep in the northern mountains. Injured hawks greeted him with soft calls. Deer waited patiently near the feeding fence. A curious fox always appeared beside the porch, as if it knew breakfast would arrive on time. Nathan smiled for the animals because they never judged him, never asked questions, and never noticed the things he wished he could erase about himself. People were different. They always seemed to notice what he believed were flaws before anything else. Years of disappointment had quietly convinced him that some hearts simply were not made to be chosen. At 25 years old, Nathan had stopped expecting anyone to prove him wrong. The old cabin where he lived sat less than a quarter mile from the rehabilitation center, surrounded by endless forests and frozen streams. Its walls were covered with photographs of rescued animals returning to the wild, but there was not a single picture of Nathan himself. Even the small mirror hanging beside the front door was turned slightly toward the wall. It had become a habit so ordinary that he rarely noticed it anymore. Looking at himself felt unnecessary. The forest had always been kinder than reflections. That afternoon, heavy clouds rolled across the mountains much earlier than expected. The weather forecast had warned about light snowfall, but mountain weather often ignored predictions. Nathan finished checking the shelters before grabbing his backpack and heading toward a familiar trail leading through the pines. A family of injured elk had recently been spotted near an old creek, and he wanted to make sure they had safely moved to lower ground before the storm arrived. Snowflakes drifted gently through the air, settling across evergreen branches and covering old footprints with fresh white silence. Nathan breathed deeply, appreciating the crisp scent of pine and cold earth. Out there, surrounded by nature, he could almost forget the quiet loneliness he carried home every evening. As he rounded a bend near the frozen creek, something unusual caught his attention. A pair of fresh boot prints crossed the untouched trail. They were too large to belong to another volunteer and far too recent to have been left before the snow began falling. Nathan slowed his pace, instinctively scanning the trees ahead. The forest remained still except for the soft whisper of wind through the branches. Then he saw someone standing alone beside the creek. The stranger wore a long, dark winter coat dusted with snow, his posture calm despite the freezing temperature. He was looking across the frozen water as though searching for something only he could see. Nathan hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Excuse me," he called politely. "These trails become dangerous once the storm gets worse. Are you lost?" The man slowly turned toward him. Golden eyes met Nathan's blue ones, steady and unexpectedly gentle. His face carried quiet confidence, yet there was unmistakable exhaustion beneath it, as if he had traveled much farther than the mountains alone could explain. "Perhaps," the stranger answered with a faint smile. "Or perhaps I have simply been walking without knowing where I belonged." Nathan blinked, surprised by the honesty in those words. Something about the stranger felt different, not frightening, not mysterious in an obvious way, just familiar, as though they shared an invisible loneliness neither had ever spoken aloud. Snow continued falling between them, while the afternoon sky grew darker. Nathan glanced toward the thickening clouds before looking back at the stranger. "My cabin is nearby," he said. "You should not stay out here once the storm arrives. I have coffee, a warm fire, and more blankets than one person could ever use." The stranger looked at him for several quiet seconds, almost as if no one had offered him kindness without expecting something in return. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you," he said softly. "My name is Julian." Nathan smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in weeks. "I am Nathan." Together, they began walking through the snow-covered forest toward the little cabin, unaware that neither of them was simply heading home. They were walking toward the moment that would quietly change everything they believed about themselves, about love, and about the extraordinary places where hope sometimes waits to be found. Nobody realizes how lonely silence can be until someone gentle chooses to share it. The walk back to the cabin felt surprisingly easy despite the steadily falling snow. Nathan expected awkward conversation with a stranger, yet every quiet moment between them felt comfortable instead of uncomfortable. Julian walked beside him with an unhurried pace, occasionally looking toward the towering pine trees as though he had not truly seen a forest in many years. When they finally reached the small wooden cabin, warm light glowed through the frosted windows, welcoming them inside. Nathan pushed open the door and immediately added another log to the stone fireplace. Bright orange flames slowly chased away the winter chill, while the familiar scent of cedar filled the room. "Please make yourself comfortable," Nathan said as he removed his gloves and winter jacket. "It is not much, but it is warm." Julian looked around the cabin with quiet appreciation. Shelves filled with books about wildlife lined one wall. Framed photographs of rescued hawks, foxes, deer, and wolves covered another. Everything reflected patience, care, and compassion. There was only one thing missing. Julian noticed there were no photographs of Nathan anywhere in the room. Nathan disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with 2 steaming mugs of fresh coffee. He handed one to Julian with an easy smile. "This helps after spending too much time outside." Julian accepted the mug carefully. "Thank you." They sat near the fire while snow quietly collected against the windows. Nathan asked simple questions about the mountains, favorite hiking trails, and whether Julian had traveled often. Julian answered politely, but never revealed more than necessary. He simply explained that he had spent most of his life carrying responsibilities that rarely allowed him to stop and enjoy ordinary moments. Nathan understood that feeling more than he expected. "I think everyone carries something they never talk about," he said softly. Julian looked at him with thoughtful curiosity. "And what do you carry?" Nathan stared into the dancing firelight before answering with a quiet laugh that lacked real happiness. "Nothing very interesting." Julian did not believe him, but he respected the silence that followed. Instead of pressing for answers, he noticed a pair of muddy boots resting near the door beside a backpack filled with animal medicine and notebooks. "You spend every day helping injured animals?" he asked. Nathan nodded. "They deserve another chance whenever possible." Julian smiled gently. "You must believe everyone deserves another chance." Nathan hesitated. "Everyone except myself." The words escaped before he realized he had spoken them aloud. The room became very still. Julian lowered his coffee without taking his eyes from Nathan. "Why would you say that?" Nathan forced another smile and quickly stood. "Because I should probably start making dinner before the power goes out." Julian understood the change of subject immediately and chose not to stop him. Together, they prepared a simple meal of vegetable soup, fresh bread, and roasted potatoes. The conversation gradually returned to lighter subjects. Nathan described the personalities of the animals he cared for, making Julian laugh for the first time when he explained how an unusually stubborn raccoon had once stolen an entire bag of apples. Hearing that genuine laugh surprised Nathan. It transformed Julian from a mysterious traveler into someone unexpectedly approachable. After dinner, they stepped onto the porch for a few minutes. Snow continued falling beneath a sky filled with slow-moving clouds. The forest seemed peaceful, almost timeless. A pair of deer cautiously emerged near the tree line before quietly continuing their journey through the snow. Nathan watched them with quiet admiration. "They always move forward," he whispered. Julian looked at him instead of the deer. "Perhaps they do because they never doubt they belong exactly where they are." Nathan remained silent. Those words settled somewhere deep inside him. As they returned indoors, a sudden sound echoed faintly through the distant mountains. It was not thunder. It sounded more like several engines traveling far beyond the forest. Nathan frowned and glanced toward the window. "That is strange. Nobody usually comes this way during a storm." Julian's expression became almost unreadable for the briefest moment before he calmly looked back into the fire. Sometimes people spend a long time searching for something they are afraid to lose. Nathan noticed the sadness hidden inside those words but asked nothing more. Outside, the snow continued falling, quietly covering every footprint that had led Julian to the cabin. while beyond the distant mountain ridge, a convoy of dark vehicles slowly advanced through the wilderness toward the only place where the missing King Alpha had finally begun to feel like an ordinary man. Never underestimate the quiet moments, because they are often where broken hearts begin learning how to trust again. Morning arrived beneath a pale winter sky as soft sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows of the cabin. Nathan woke before dawn out of habit, quietly preparing breakfast while fresh coffee filled the small kitchen with warmth. When he stepped outside, carrying 2 steaming mugs, he found Julian standing near the wooden fence, watching a pair of cardinals land on a snow-covered branch. Neither bird seemed frightened by his presence. Instead, they remained perfectly still, as though they sensed a calmness that words could never explain. Nathan handed Julian one of the mugs and smiled. They usually fly away when strangers get this close. Julian accepted the coffee with quiet gratitude while continuing to watch the birds. Perhaps they know I needed a peaceful morning. Nathan laughed softly. Then they chose the right place. After breakfast, Nathan invited Julian to help at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The small collection of wooden shelters sat less than a quarter-mile from the cabin, surrounded by towering evergreens and frozen streams. As soon as they arrived, an elderly golden retriever greeted them with a slow wag of its tail, followed by several rescued deer that approached the fence without hesitation. Julian looked genuinely surprised. "They trust you completely." Nathan smiled while filling feeding buckets with fresh hay. Trust is never demanded. It is earned one quiet day at a time. Julian repeated those words silently, allowing them to settle deep within his thoughts. Throughout the morning, they worked side by side. Nathan carefully examined the wing of a recovering hawk before releasing it into a larger enclosure, while Julian repaired loose wooden fencing with remarkable skill. Every task seemed natural to him despite his refined appearance. Nathan eventually noticed how easily Julian handled heavy timber without complaint. "You have done this before," he observed. Julian smiled faintly. "Not exactly this, but I have learned that every leader should know how to repair what protects others." Nathan looked at him with curiosity. "That sounds like something my grandfather would have said." Julian chuckled quietly. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." The hours passed more quickly than either of them expected. Around noon, Nathan packed sandwiches and warm cider before leading Julian toward a scenic overlook above the valley. The trail wound through snow-covered pines until the trees opened to reveal miles of untouched wilderness stretching beneath brilliant blue skies. Nathan lifted his camera and began photographing a herd of elk moving gracefully across the distant hillside. Julian watched him with quiet admiration. Nathan looked completely different while working. The uncertainty that shadowed his eyes inside the cabin disappeared whenever he focused on protecting wildlife. "You seem happiest when you forget yourself," Julian said gently. Nathan lowered the camera. "Maybe because animals never ask me to be anything except kind." Julian hesitated before answering. "I think people sometimes forget that kindness is enough." Nathan looked away toward the mountains. Not everyone believes that. They continued walking until they reached a frozen lake reflecting the winter sky like polished glass. Nathan paused, noticing his reflection shimmering across the ice. Almost instinctively, he stepped backward. Julian quietly noticed the movement. "You avoid mirrors," he said softly. Nathan forced a small smile. "Old habit." Julian did not press for an explanation. Instead, he knelt beside the frozen shoreline and gently brushed fresh snow away from a cluster of tiny animal tracks crossing the ice. "These prints are beautiful," he said. Nathan looked down. Most people would never stop to notice them. Julian stood and met Nathan's eyes with complete sincerity. Perhaps that is because most people spend too much time looking at themselves instead of what truly matters. Nathan felt something shift inside him. No one had ever spoken to him with such quiet understanding, without pity or judgment. Before he could answer, the peaceful silence was interrupted by a faint mechanical sound drifting across the valley. Nathan frowned and looked toward the distant mountain ridge where several dark vehicles slowly emerged between the trees before disappearing again behind the forest. "Those engines again," he whispered. Julian's calm expression remained unchanged, but his golden eyes followed the distant movement with unmistakable recognition. Nathan turned toward him. "Julian, are those people searching for you?" Julian remained silent for several long moments before quietly answering, "Yes, and I am beginning to think they are much closer than either of us expected." Sometimes the hardest truth to face is not who someone else really is, but how deeply they have already changed your heart. The journey back to the cabin was quieter than usual. Snow continued falling in slow, gentle waves while the distant sound of engines faded behind the mountains. Nathan walked beside Julian without speaking, replaying the conversation in his mind. He had known from the beginning that Julian carried secrets. Somehow, however, those secrets no longer frightened him. What unsettled him was the realization that he cared enough to worry about whatever waited beyond those distant ridges. By the time they reached the cabin, twilight had settled across the forest. Nathan lit the lantern hanging above the porch before placing another log into the fireplace. Warm light filled the small room while the storm outside grew stronger. Julian stood beside the window for a long moment, quietly watching fresh snow erase every footprint leading to the cabin. "The mountains have a way of hiding people," Nathan said as he poured 2 mugs of hot tea. "Sometimes that is a blessing." Julian accepted the cup with a thoughtful smile. "And sometimes it only delays what eventually finds us." Nathan studied his face carefully. "Who are you hiding from?" Julian looked into the steaming tea before answering. "Not from someone. From responsibilities that never stop waiting." Nathan nodded slowly. "That sounds exhausting." Julian laughed softly. "It is." Neither of them noticed how naturally the conversation had become more honest than before. Nathan prepared a simple dinner, while Julian quietly helped set the table without being asked. The little cabin felt unusually peaceful, as though the storm itself had wrapped the world in silence. During dinner, Nathan finally spoke the question that had lingered in his thoughts for 2 days. "When you looked at the animals today, they trusted you immediately. Even the wolves near the rehabilitation center stayed calm." "That does not happen often." Julian smiled faintly. "Animals usually recognize intentions long before people do." Nathan rested his elbows on the table. "And what intentions do they see in you?" Julian answered without hesitation. "The hope that no one under my care has to face the world alone." Nathan looked down at his bowl. Those words touched something he rarely allowed anyone see. After dinner, they stepped outside once more. The snowfall had stopped, revealing a sky filled with bright winter stars. The forest seemed endless beneath the moonlight. Nathan wrapped his coat more tightly around himself as they slowly walked toward the frozen creek. "Can I tell you something?" he asked quietly. Julian nodded. "When I was younger, I believed if I worked hard enough, helped enough people, and never caused trouble, eventually someone would choose me." He smiled sadly. "After a while, I stopped waiting." Julian remained silent, giving Nathan the space to continue. "It became easier to care for injured animals than to let people get close. Animals leave because they heal. People leave because they choose to." For several moments, only the sound of the creek beneath the ice filled the silence. Finally, Julian spoke. "I think you have spent too many years believing other people's decisions define your worth." Nathan looked away. "Maybe they do." Julian gently shook his head. "Worth is not something another person gives you. It already exists, even when you cannot see it." Nathan wanted to argue, yet something in Julian's calm voice made the words impossible to dismiss. Before either man could say more, several bright headlights suddenly appeared beyond the trees at the far edge of the valley. The vehicles stopped without approaching the cabin. Moments later, a single figure stepped out, accompanied by 2 attendants who remained respectfully behind. Even from a distance, the visitor carried the quiet confidence of someone delivering important news rather than making demands. Julian's expression changed immediately. He recognized the newcomer. Nathan noticed the shift. "You know them?" Julian slowly nodded. Yes. The visitor removed a hood, revealing an elderly woman with silver hair. She did not call out or move closer. Instead, she simply placed one hand over her heart in a respectful greeting before waiting in silence. Nathan looked at Julian with growing concern. Julian took a slow breath, knowing the peaceful life he had briefly shared inside the little cabin had reached the moment he could no longer keep the truth hidden, and he quietly whispered, "Tomorrow, I will tell you everything." The moment we stop running from the truth is often the moment our lives begin to change forever. Nathan barely slept that night. Long after the fire had burned low and the cabin had fallen silent, he found himself staring out the frost-covered window toward the distant valley where the elderly woman had quietly waited before leaving with the approaching darkness. Julian had promised answers, yet somehow Nathan feared the answers would change everything. Dawn arrived beneath a pale gray sky. Fresh snow covered the forest once again, making the mountains appear untouched, as though yesterday had never happened. Nathan quietly prepared breakfast while the familiar smell of fresh coffee filled the cabin. Julian entered the kitchen a few moments later, offering a gentle smile that carried both gratitude and quiet sadness. They sat across from one another without speaking until Nathan finally broke the silence. "You said you would tell me everything." Julian nodded. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug before looking directly into Nathan's eyes. "My full name is Julian Ashcroft." Nathan listened carefully. "I'm the King Alpha of the Ashcroft Kingdom." The words settled into the quiet room without drama. Nathan did not interrupt. He simply watched Julian's expression, realizing that the title seemed far heavier than impressive. Julian continued softly. "Several weeks ago, disagreements within the royal council became impossible to ignore. Some believed the kingdom needed fear to maintain order. I believe trust would always create stronger loyalty than fear. I left the castle alone because I needed time to think without anyone telling me who I should become." Nathan slowly lowered his gaze. Suddenly, every unexplained detail began fitting together. The search vehicles, the respectful elderly woman, the calm authority Julian carried without trying, even the way animals naturally trusted him. "So everyone has been searching for their king," Nathan whispered. Julian nodded once. "Not because I disappeared, because they believed the future of the kingdom disappeared with me." Silence settled between them. Nathan quietly stood and walked toward the small window overlooking the snow-covered forest. His reflection faintly appeared in the glass, but instead of avoiding it, he remained still. "You should go back," he said almost in a whisper. Julian rose immediately. "Nathan." Nathan gently shook his head. "You belong somewhere important." "I do not." Julian stepped closer. "Do not decide where you belong by comparing yourself to me." Nathan smiled sadly. "That is easy for you to say." Julian's voice remained calm. "No, it is not. Every day of my life, people have seen my title before they ever saw me. You're the first person who simply offered me coffee and a warm fire." Nathan looked away before quietly answering. "And you're the first person who ever looked at me like there was nothing wrong with me." Their eyes met. Neither man spoke for several long seconds. The silence carried more honesty than either of them had ever shared with anyone else. Just then, gentle footsteps approached the porch. Julian opened the door and found the elderly messenger waiting patiently beside a snow-covered vehicle. She lowered her head respectfully. "Your Majesty, the council has agreed to wait until sunset. They hope you will return willingly." Julian thanked her before promising they would leave within the hour. After she stepped away, Nathan quietly packed a small bag with food for the journey. Julian watched him with concern. "You do not have to help me." Nathan smiled faintly while placing fresh bread into the bag. "Helping people is the only thing I have ever been good at." Julian walked toward him and gently rested a hand over Nathan's. "You are wrong." Nathan looked up. "Your kindness has changed more lives than you realize, including mine." Nathan felt warmth spread quietly through his heart, yet an old familiar fear quickly followed. How could someone like a King Alpha ever truly need someone like him? By late morning, they stood together outside the cabin. The forest looked peaceful beneath the bright winter sun, but the road leading toward the distant mountains felt impossibly long. As Julian stepped toward the waiting vehicle, Nathan remained beside the wooden fence, forcing himself to smile. Julian paused before getting inside. "Will you come with me?" The unexpected question left Nathan speechless. He looked from the elegant vehicle to the quiet cabin that had always been his refuge. For the first time in years, he stood between the safety of everything he had known and the frightening possibility that perhaps his life was meant to become something greater than the lonely future he had already accepted. Sometimes the bravest decision is not taking the first step forward, is believing you deserve to take it at all. Nathan looked from the waiting vehicle to the familiar cabin one last time. Every board in the old wooden porch, every snow-covered pine surrounding the property, every quiet trail through the forest had become part of the life he understood. Beyond the mountains waited a kingdom he had never imagined entering, a place where he believed someone like him could never belong. Julian remained beside the open vehicle door without saying another word. He knew this decision had to belong entirely to Nathan. After several long moments, Nathan drew a slow breath and smiled softly. "I'm still afraid," he admitted. Julian nodded with complete understanding. "So am I." Nathan looked surprised. "A king alpha can be afraid?" Julian laughed quietly. "Every day. The difference is that most people never see it." That simple honesty eased something inside Nathan. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and took one careful step forward. "Then maybe we can both be afraid together." A grateful smile spread across Julian's face. "I would like that." The journey through the mountains lasted several hours. Snow-covered forests gradually gave way to wide valleys, frozen rivers, and quiet villages where families waved as the royal vehicle passed. Nathan noticed something unexpected. The people did not appear frightened of their king. Instead, they smiled warmly whenever they recognized Julian. Children stopped building snowmen just to wave excitedly. Elderly couples nodded with genuine affection. Farmers raised their hands in greeting from distant fields. Nathan watched quietly through the window. "They really care about you." Julian looked toward the villages with a thoughtful expression. "I try to remember their names whenever I visit. Leadership becomes easier when people feel seen." Nathan smiled. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." As the afternoon sun lowered across the mountains, Ashcroft Castle finally appeared beyond the valley. Tall stone towers rose above the snow, while elegant banners moved gently in the winter breeze. The castle looked magnificent, yet Nathan's first impression was not its size. It was how alive it felt. Workers carried supplies through the courtyard. Children laughed while chasing one another across the open square. Musicians quietly practiced near the entrance hall. Instead of feeling distant, the castle felt like the heart of an entire community. When the vehicle stopped, Julian stepped out first before turning back toward Nathan. "Ready?" Nathan looked at the enormous gates and laughed nervously. "Probably not." Julian offered his hand with an encouraging smile. "Neither was I the first time." Nathan accepted the gesture, and together they entered the castle grounds. Servants greeted Julian respectfully, but Nathan quickly noticed something else. Nobody ignored him. They smiled politely, welcomed him kindly, and continued their work without whispering or staring. The warmth surprised him more than the castle itself. An elderly housekeeper approached carrying 2 cups of hot tea. "Welcome," she said gently to Nathan. "Anyone trusted by His Majesty is welcome here." Nathan thanked her quietly, unsure how to respond. As they walked through wide stone corridors decorated with paintings and carved wooden beams, Julian slowed his pace. "I know this place can feel overwhelming." Nathan looked around carefully. "It is beautiful." Julian smiled. "It only became beautiful again after I remembered why it exists. It is supposed to serve people, not impress them." Those words stayed with Nathan as they entered a spacious library overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Shelves filled with books stretched toward the ceiling, while afternoon sunlight poured through tall windows. Julian stopped beside one of them. "There is something I need to show you." He reached into a nearby cabinet and removed a collection of photographs. Nathan looked closer. They showed wildlife preserves, forests, rivers, and rescued animals throughout the kingdom. These are all places that need someone who understands them better than I do, Julian said quietly. Nathan looked from the photographs back to Julian. Why are you showing me this? Julian answered without hesitation. Because I'm not asking you to become part of my world. I'm asking whether we can build a better one together. Before Nathan could answer, the large wooden doors slowly opened. Several senior council members entered the library with respectful expressions. Most greeted Julian warmly, but one older counselor stopped after noticing Nathan. His thoughtful gaze lingered for a moment before he calmly asked, "Your Majesty, is this the gentleman whose kindness has already begun changing the way you lead our kingdom?" Nathan's heart skipped a beat as he realized that, without ever intending to, his quiet life in the mountains had already reached far beyond the little cabin he once believed would always be the entire world. The people who truly change our lives are often the ones who teach us to see ourselves through kinder eyes. Nathan stood quietly in the library as the council members entered one by one. Although every greeting remained respectful, he could not ignore the feeling that he did not belong among polished stone walls, ancient books, and generations of royal tradition. The older counselor who had spoken first stepped forward with calm dignity before offering a courteous nod. "Welcome to Ashcroft Castle, Mr. Brooks," he said. "His Majesty has spoken highly of your kindness." Nathan smiled politely, unsure how to answer. Before he could find the right words, Julian stepped beside him with quiet confidence. Nathan has spent years protecting wildlife, caring for injured animals, and giving hope to lives others overlooked, he said. If there is anyone worthy of respect in this room, it is him. Nathan glanced toward Julian with surprise. No one had ever spoken about him that way before. The council members exchanged thoughtful looks. Most appeared curious rather than judgmental, yet one distinguished elder folded his hands calmly before speaking. "Your Majesty, no one questions Mr. Brooks' character. Our concern is whether someone unfamiliar with royal responsibilities should become closely involved in matters affecting the kingdom." Julian listened without interruption. "A fair question," he replied. "Then allow me to answer it honestly." He slowly walked toward the large window overlooking the villages below. "For years we have measured strength through titles, traditions, and influence. During my time away, I met someone who never asked whether I was a king. He asked whether I was cold. He offered warmth before knowing my name. That single act reminded me what leadership is supposed to protect." Silence filled the library. Nathan lowered his eyes, overwhelmed by words he never expected to hear. The older counselor who had first greeted Nathan smiled faintly. "Compassion has always been one of the oldest strengths of our kingdom." Another council member nodded in agreement. "Perhaps we have simply forgotten it." The atmosphere gradually softened. Instead of debating Nathan's presence, the conversation shifted toward the future of the kingdom. Julian invited Nathan to join him as they reviewed maps showing protected forests, migration routes, and wildlife habitats throughout the northern mountains. Nathan studied each map carefully before offering several practical suggestions based on his years working with injured animals. He pointed out natural corridors that could connect isolated habitats, recommended safer locations for rehabilitation centers, and explained how preserving healthy ecosystems would also benefit nearby communities. The council listened attentively. No one interrupted him. No one questioned whether his voice deserved to be heard. When he finished, the room remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, the eldest counselor smiled warmly. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "your knowledge is exactly the kind of wisdom that cannot be learned inside castle walls." Nathan felt genuine surprise. For most of his life, he had believed his experiences mattered only to himself. Hearing someone value his perspective felt unfamiliar, yet deeply comforting. After the meeting concluded, Julian led Nathan through the castle gardens where the final traces of winter sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Birds moved freely among evergreen branches while a small family of deer grazed peacefully near the forest edge. Nathan looked around in amazement. "You protected all of this?" Julian shook his head gently. "Many people protected it long before I became king. I simply hope to leave it better than I found it. Nathan smiled. That sounds like the way you treat people too. Julian laughed softly. I learned that from you. They continued walking until they reached a quiet stone terrace overlooking the valley. Nathan rested his hands against the railing, watching sunlight stretch across the distant forests. For the first time in many years, he realized he had gone an entire day without avoiding his own reflection in a nearby window. The thought made a pause. He was changing in ways he had never expected. Julian noticed the thoughtful expression on Nathan's face. What are you thinking about? Nathan smiled gently. For the first time in a long time, I am wondering who I might become instead of worrying about who I used to be. Julian looked toward the horizon with quiet satisfaction. That is where every new beginning starts. As evening settled over the kingdom, bells echoed softly from the castle towers, calling the people together for the annual Winter's End celebration. Lanterns began glowing throughout the villages below, while music drifted upward on the cool mountain breeze. Nathan had no idea that before the night was over, Julian would make a choice in front of the entire kingdom that would forever erase the last doubt Nathan still carried about whether he was truly worthy of being loved. The greatest gift another person can give us is not love itself. It is the courage to believe we are worthy of receiving it. As twilight settled across Ashcroft Kingdom, thousands of lanterns slowly illuminated the castle grounds. Warm golden lights stretched along stone pathways while music floated through the crisp mountain air. Families gathered in the central courtyard to celebrate the annual Winter's End Festival, marking the arrival of a new season and the hope that came with it. Nathan stood quietly near one of the castle balconies, watching children laugh as they released glowing paper lanterns into the evening sky. The celebration felt joyful, yet a familiar uncertainty still lingered inside him. He admired the happiness surrounding him, but wondered whether he truly belonged within it. Julian approached carrying 2 cups of warm apple cider and handed one to Nathan with a gentle smile. You have been hiding for almost 20 minutes, he teased softly. Nathan laughed. Old habits are difficult to break. Julian leaned comfortably against the stone railing beside him. Then we will replace them with better ones. Nathan looked toward the courtyard below, where music and laughter continued filling the evening. Everyone here knows exactly who they are. I'm still trying to figure that out. Julian turned to face him completely. Nathan, when I first met you in the forest, you welcomed a stranger without asking what he could offer you. Since then, I have watched you care for every person and every animal with the same quiet kindness. You have never needed a title to know who you are. Nathan lowered his eyes. It is easier to believe that about everyone else. Julian smiled gently. Then allow someone else to believe it about you until you finally can. Before Nathan could answer, the sound of ceremonial bells echoed across the castle grounds. The celebration gradually became quiet as the people gathered before the main staircase. Members of the royal council took their places while musicians lowered their instruments. Julian offered Nathan an encouraging look before walking toward the center balcony overlooking the courtyard. Nathan remained a few steps behind, expecting only another formal address. Instead, Julian began speaking with calm sincerity. For many years, I believed that leadership meant carrying every burden alone. I believed strength required distance, and that responsibility demanded sacrifice without comfort. Then, during a winter storm, I met someone who reminded me that true strength begins with compassion. Thousands of eyes turned toward Julian. The courtyard remained completely silent. Julian continued, his voice steady and warm. That person did not recognize a crown. He recognized another human being who needed warmth, food, and kindness. He asked for nothing in return. Because of him, I remembered that every kingdom becomes stronger when people choose empathy before judgment. Nathan felt his heart racing. He never expected Julian to share such deeply personal words before the entire kingdom. Julian slowly turned toward him and extended one welcoming hand. Nathan Brooks, would you join me? Every instinct told Nathan to step back, but another voice inside him, one that had grown stronger with every conversation they had shared, quietly urged him forward. He walked across the stone balcony until he stood beside Julian. Instead of feeling exposed, he felt unexpectedly calm. Julian looked toward the gathered crowd. Today I wish to honor the man whose kindness reminded your King Alpha what leadership should look like. His compassion has already shaped decisions that will protect our forests, strengthen our communities, and inspire a new wildlife conservation program throughout our kingdom. Warm applause gradually filled the courtyard. It began with a few council members, spread through the gathered families, and soon echoed across the entire castle. Nathan stood speechless. No one was applauding because he was extraordinary. They were applauding because kindness mattered. Tears quietly filled his eyes as he realized something remarkable. For the first time in his life, he was not searching the faces around him for signs of rejection. He was simply allowing himself to be present. Julian leaned closer and spoke softly enough that only Nathan could hear. "Do you remember what you told me in the forest? You said animals deserve another chance. I think people do too." Nathan smiled through grateful tears. "Including me?" Julian's answer came without hesitation. "Especially you." Above them, hundreds of glowing lanterns drifted into the night sky, carrying with them the final shadows of the doubts Nathan had carried for so many years, while somewhere deep inside his heart, he quietly realized that the person he had spent his entire life waiting to become had already been there all along. The happiest endings are not the ones where every fear disappears. They are the ones where love becomes stronger than every fear that remains. Spring arrived gently across the Ashcroft kingdom, replacing the last traces of winter with fresh green forests, flowing rivers, and warm sunlight stretching across the mountains. Several months had passed since the winter's end celebration, and life had settled into a peaceful rhythm that neither Nathan nor Julian could have imagined when they first met beside the frozen creek. Every week, Nathan traveled between the castle and his little cabin in the mountains, refusing to abandon either place because both had become part of who he was. Julian often joined him whenever royal duties allowed, trading grand halls for quiet trails where the only sounds were birds singing above the pine trees and the wind moving gently through the branches. Together, they transformed an unused section of royal land into the largest wildlife rehabilitation and conservation center the kingdom had ever known. Volunteers arrived from every corner of the mountains. Veterinarians, park rangers, students, and local families worked side by side, proving that compassion could unite people from every background. Nathan smiled every morning as rescued hawks returned to the sky, young deer recovered in protected meadows, and injured foxes found safety before returning to the wild. One afternoon, while organizing supplies inside the new center, Nathan noticed something hanging beside the entrance. It was a simple wooden mirror framed with carved pine branches. Months earlier, he would have instinctively looked away. This time he paused. His reflection looked back at him with calm blue eyes, a relaxed smile, and quiet confidence. For several long seconds, he simply stood there, surprised by one extraordinary realization. He no longer searched the mirror for flaws. He saw someone who had spent years helping others and had finally learned to offer himself the same kindness. Julian quietly entered the room carrying a small wooden box. He stopped when he noticed Nathan smiling at his own reflection. "You did not look away," Julian said softly. Nathan turned toward him, his smile growing warmer. "I finally realized the mirror was never the problem." Julian crossed the room and handed him the box. Inside rested a beautifully crafted silver ring engraved with tiny pine branches surrounding the silhouette of a soaring hawk. Beneath it lay a handwritten note. Nathan opened it carefully. The words were simple. You never needed to become someone different to deserve love. You only needed someone to remind you of the truth you had forgotten. Nathan looked up, his eyes shining with gratitude. "You always know exactly what to say." Julian smiled gently. "Because everything I wrote was already true before we met." Nathan laughed quietly. "Then why did it take me so long to believe it?" Julian reached out and took Nathan's hand with quiet tenderness. "Sometimes the heart believes its oldest fears more easily than its newest hopes. I simply stayed long enough for hope to become stronger. Nathan nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle peacefully inside him. Outside, children released several rescued birds into the bright afternoon sky, while families applauded from the meadow below. The entire conservation center had become a symbol of renewal for the kingdom, reminding everyone that healing was possible whenever compassion came first. As the sun slowly began setting behind the mountains, Nathan and Julian walked together along the familiar forest trail, leading back toward the little cabin where everything had begun. The trees looked greener now, the streams flowed freely once again, and wildflowers covered the edges of the path. They stopped beside the same frozen creek that had long since become a clear running stream. Nathan smiled as he looked across the water. I used to think this place was where I met a stranger. Julian looked at him with quiet affection. And now, Nathan gently squeezed his hand. Now I know it was where I finally met the person who helped me find myself. Julian's smile reflected the same quiet happiness. And I found the person who reminded a king that kindness is the greatest strength anyone can possess. They continued walking beneath the golden evening light until the cabin appeared between the pine trees, exactly as it had on the day they first met. This time, however, it was no longer a place where loneliness waited behind a closed door. It had become a home filled with laughter, purpose, friendship, rescued lives, and a future built together. Years later, visitors to the Conservation Center often heard the story of how one simple act of kindness changed two lives forever. They were told that every rescued animal deserved another chance because every living heart carried unseen wounds. Very few knew that the greatest rescue had never happened inside the forest at all. It happened when one gentle Omega finally believed he was worthy of being loved, and one compassionate King Alpha proved that the truest home is created whenever two hearts choose each other with patience, trust, and unwavering hope.